Welcome to this final mini lecture of Module 10. In this mini lecture, we're going to explore one of the major strategies that are introduced by narrative therapy. As you remember, I mentioned that narrative therapy is one of those therapeutic modalities that fall within the postmodern approaches. It emerged in late 80s and really come to attention of many psychologists, counselors, and even social workers and community workers. These two people, Michael White and David Epstein from Australia and New Zealand, were behind most of its development, but later many others contributed to formulation of various perspectives and strategies in working with people that emerged in narrative practice. In many ways, we can say that narrative therapy or narrative practice has quite a fresh and invigorating perspective on many aspects of working with people and helping them move forward with their lives. It really values innovation and creativity that goes aligned and in the same line kind of with some of those philosophical underpinnings that I outlined earlier. A lot of the ideas that are introduced in this mini lecture, more specifically in relation to externalization or externalizing conversations, are really broader than they fit into this mini lecture. And you can see that already this mini lecture is a long one, but I really encourage you to read further, and if you're interested to get more engaged with practices that sort of outline and clarify what is narrative therapy and what it tries to do and how it differs with some of the other modalities that you have become or will become familiar with later. The critics kind of postulate sort of position that it's really difficult, complex, challenging, and time-consuming for a lot of practitioners to grasp some of the ideas behind and the intentions behind the things narrative therapy introduces. And, in many cases, quite a number of years might be required to really understand some of the intentions and reasons and ways that narrative therapy kind of looks at working with people a bit differently. So I'm just trying to clarify, some of the really different ways that some of these ideas are introduced here, making our minds catch up with this shift from a modern approach to a postmodern approach on people and their problems is not an easy task. More specifically, we grow up being socialized into particular views and matters related to the nature of human being and the problems they face. Our environment imposes a particular view on such matters, and that view is pervasively aligned with many of the modern perspectives on the nature of problems. Those modern views on the nature of problems are often pretty much and strongly aligned and based on a medical model. Now, I'm not going to say that this medical model is problematic, but all we say is that applying only the medical model on how problems of psychological and sociological nature operate in the lives of people is limiting and is not really what should be all that we do. But we must be able to develop new and other forms of working with people that might be liberating for them and help them to feel less medicalized, which at the same time helps them feel less perhaps stigmatized. In any case, narrative therapy proposes that its complexity is inevitable, as it first really requires practitioners to make a shift in their worldviews about the nature of people and their problems, to break free of one way of looking at things, and then to really get to a point of believing that all people are in essence capable and agentic beings. That perhaps often it is their environments and particular forces around them in those environments that have been much more active in limiting a lot of possibilities for them. So that is how narrative therapy has a more sociological and perhaps anthropological lens sometimes. And it's perhaps the only modality that considers issues of social justice and inequity and inequality in societies, and how attending to such matters also becomes a task of the practitioner. In doing so, narrative therapy poses as a highly respectful way of working with people and tries to promote a strong sense of agency for people. Narrative therapists makes it their responsibility to separate the person from the problem, to minimize the amount of stigma and blame on people. Narrative therapy really views people as the expert of their lives. It genuinely tries to stick to that kind of approach. And it doesn't define a role for counselors in which they need to propose a particular way of looking at their life or follow a particular mode of action to improve their circumstances. Now, in this mini lecture, we are specifically covering the strategy known as externalizing conversations. Before saying what it is, I just need to highlight that externalizing is only one of the many strategies that are brought forward by narrative therapy, and there are many other things that it promotes. But again, since covering all of those strategies are beyond our time, I focus on this particular strategy since perhaps it is one of the most primary things that you need to learn in facilitating narrative practice and following on those kind of ways. All right, so the background idea is that there are certain dominant forces in our social context, in our societies, in our environments, that repeatedly convey the message that problems reside within us. Language is perhaps the most common factor. Every day we use language in such a way to talk about people or ourselves as problematic beings. We refer to others, or maybe even sometimes ourselves, with a language that represents us as having problems or as being problematic, as if the problems reside within us, or as if we are the problem or someone is the problem. People therefore often see problems as an inherent part of themselves and their identity. Now, this becomes even more so problematic and gradually makes people less able in the face of the problem that emerge in their lives. In fact, problems are always around us, and we are continually solving problems as we go about living our lives, if we pay attention. The moment we open our eyes every morning, there are some problems lurking around, and we do things, often very simple things, to solve them one after the other. And we distance ourselves from that problem state and its effects. So we move away from the influence of problems. For example, there's a lateness problem and we hurry a little bit. We rush and we do things a bit faster, all right? And we overcome that problem. In a different situation, there's a hunger problem and we go about eating something or buying something to eat. And we get rid of that problem. And then there are probably other problems. There might be an anxiety problem around and deadline is approaching and we do hard work for a few days, maybe even staying awake for a couple of nights, and then we get to submit that assignment on time, or maybe maximum with a few days of delays, and here we go. We have liberated ourselves from the anxiety problem. So you can see the point I'm trying to make. We are constantly solving problems, but we are not actually aware of the sort of efforts that we're doing and our strategies or skills in making solutions appear. But it is quite interesting and a very curious case as to what happens that we become ignorant of our capabilities in developing solutions and we minimize all of our skills. You start to focus only on the effects of the problem and develop an internalized view of the problem and start to kind of lose that agency and belief in ourselves. Sometimes our environments are also good in pushing problems into us. So narrative therapy considers it its tasks to liberate people from the view that you are a problematic being. In fact, there was a very famous phrase by Michael White that looks pretty simple, but really invites you to think about it, which is the person is not the problem is the problem. So this sentence basically becomes the foundation for externalizing conversations. Now, what happens by externalizing? Externalizing conversations have the intention to separate the problems from people and place them in such a different position so that the person can gradually visualize or consider it outside of their sense of self. All right? For example, externalizing conversations aim to help the person who said that I'm a very nervous person to shift their view gradually and actually become able to see themselves as someone who's being influenced by nervousness. This shift could eventually enable the person to develop an alternative kind of relationship with this entity called nervousness. This means that the person gains some control over nervousness rather than nervousness dominating and controlling this person's life. Now, one very simple and good example for this is the black dog story, which is developed by the World Health Organization. And I now invite you to watch that video first after this brief part 1. This video will give you a really good idea of what it would be like to talk about problems in an externalized way. And then we could start characterizing the problem for redefining a new way of relating to the problem instead of seeing it as an inner part of our sort of inner self, After that, we'll come back to the second part of this mini lecture.